For those of you who have attended a number of ATHENAs, you know that we enjoy having a colloquy right after lunch. And since we know that right after lunch is always a snooze time, we decided we would make certain that didn't happen this year. So we are pleased and delighted to have Daniel de Vise, the National Higher Education Reporter for the Washington Post. He's been reporting for over 20 years. You can find a number of his very thoughtful pieces in our packets today, and we're delighted to have him here, as well as Larry Summers, former president of Harvard. We all know him through the social network, and I don't think I really need to do any introduction. So at this point, I'll let these two folks take over. We'll hope to have a little time for Q&A, and then Daniel also will take questions as a reporter in terms of what he sees are issues, as well as President Summers. So welcome to you both. We look forward to the discussion.
Well, Dr. Summers, thank you for coming. I don't think I've ever done a public interview before. Perhaps you have. I've got a few questions that I will ask, a few that I won't ask, and I hope that you all will ask him questions and not me at the end, because his opinions are way more interesting and probably more valuable than mine. The first thing I noticed when I was reading his bio, I read actually on Wikipedia that Henry Kissinger once said that this guy should be, quote, given a White House post in which he is charged with shooting down or fixing bad ideas. So in the context of higher education, what are a few bad ideas and how would you fix them?
Not entirely certain where to start. Look, I think higher education is one of America's huge strengths, and anything you say criticizing American higher education, and there's plenty to say, needs to recognize that American higher education excels relative to the rest of the world more than virtually anything else American excels relative to the rest of the world, and that we are an extraordinary magnet for talent of all kinds to come to our universities. And while they may seem remarkably dysfunctional in many, many ways, they somehow do meet a test of attractiveness. And I think that's hugely important. Some of the things that aggravated me, have aggravated me during my time in higher education would be these. An excessively relativist approach to truth. I once was present at a commencement speech at another university, and the president of the university spoke about, here at this great university, we sift data, we argue, we challenge, we consider every topic, we weigh and balance every perspective, and out of that comes, and I knew how I would have finished that sentence, comes a closer approximation to the truth we will never fully found. And this president continued, out of that comes a greater and deeper respect for each other's opinion. And those are profoundly different perspectives. Whether 2 + 2 = 4 or 5 is not really a matter of debate. Whether F equals MA or equals something else should not properly be a matter of debate. And whether it is the high relativism of the right that talks about evolutionary science and creation science as two alternative perspectives, or the perspective that holds that there's a particularly feminist view of physics that contributes to the understanding of physics. You are talking about deeply problematic notions, and they are quite pervasive in the academy. Second, it is the essence of the difference between market economies and socialist economies. That in socialist economies, you bribe your butcher to get a cut of meat. And fundamentally, customers try to make themselves attractive to producers and providers. And producers and providers have the leverage. Just walk outside and see all the advertisements, see all the offers. Think about it in capitalism. Do purchasing agents get bribed, or do selling agents, or do salesmen get bribed? You know who gets bribed, it's purchasing agents. The power is all on the side of the customer, not on the provider. And yet, so much in higher education is, not just in higher education, actually in all of education, is a system that is run for the convenience of the providers rather than run for the convenience of the consumers. There is a classic economic analysis. It goes back many, many years. It's referred to in economics because workers' co-ops were a very popular form of organization under Tito, as the analysis of the Yugoslav firm. And what it basically says is that if you have a firm that's run by the workers, it will stay too small and be too comfortable for the existing workers, because if you let more workers in, it dilutes all the existing benefits. That's why it's usually thought they don't. Universities, Adam Smith said this actually, schools and universities that are run for the convenience of the masters rarely are hugely efficient and effective organizations. I think there needs to be much more attention directed to what the ultimate objectives of higher education institutions are and serving them. And the operation of faculty governance can, in many respects, be problematic. Third, the end of mandatory retirement was a disaster in higher education. The median age of the tenured faculty at Harvard is now 58. Now, think about any leading business and think about the set of 200 senior people in it. Can you think of any leading business where the median age of the top 200 people would be 58 or 59? Now, to be sure, Harvard is in a different activity than most businesses. How does Harvard's activity differ? Well, an absolutely core and fundamental thing that Harvard does is relate to 19-year-olds and relate to students. That would probably not be a reason why you should have an older group than most do. The other absolutely crucial mission that a leading university has is creative ideas, disruptive innovations, challenges to conventional wisdom. That's what research does at its best. That would probably not be a reason why you'd want to have an older group rather than a younger group. The combination of tenure and mandatory retirement is deeply, and faculty governance, is deeply toxic. It is not only because people stay too long. It is also because people who stay have control rights. It's not just that there's a question whether the slot for a developmental biologist is in most cases going to be best occupied by a 74-year-old. It is also a question of whether the best person to play a central role in deciding who the new developmental biologist for the next 30 years is going to be is a 74-year-old. And yet, in the way that our universities are structured, those two functions are dovetailed. Now, I do not want to be misunderstood. There are extraordinary, brilliant, and able scholars working in their 70s and in a few rare cases in their 80s. There is not any compelling case for age discrimination. But when there's mandatory retirement, there's the possibility of rehiring. And when there's no mandatory retirement, there's no possibility of doing something about tenure. So I could go on, but I'll start with these three. Pervasive relativism, excessive attentiveness to the convenience of the providers of service, and the excessive aging driven by driven by the lack of mandatory retirement of leading faculty. I'd say one other. Let me just introduce a caveat, which I will not keep repeating. American higher education is an extraordinarily far-flung thing. My personal experiences have been with a small but disproportionately influential segment of higher education, the leading private research university. And so the perspective I'm going to bring in answering these questions is really a perspective on that group, which I think is disproportionately important to its numbers because of the ways in which it sets the tone. But I don't want to hear, but my answers should be understood as coming from somebody who brings that perspective. And I'm not bringing that perspective because I think that segment is the most important or the most flawed or the most to be admired and studied. But I'm bringing that perspective because it's probably better to talk about what I know about and have experienced than to talk about what I don't know much about.
I'll throw together a couple of thoughts that just sort of alighted in my head. You were talking about tenure, and as best I understand it, the sort of machinery of tenure and the machinery of career advancement, and I think you had tenure at age 28 or some ridiculously young age, rewards professors not so much for teaching courses well or grading papers thoroughly or assigning a lot of work and grading it or interacting with students, but rather for sort of this routine of writing and publishing scholarship, right? At a place like Harvard, certainly, or Johns Hopkins or UVA, the professors who get somewhere in life are the ones who amass these. I mean, my resume is 1 page long. These people amass, 40, 50-page resumes, endless publications. Where do they find the time to write all these things? Well, a lot of them are not particularly involved in teaching courses. Somebody at a conference cited some statistic that at that moment in time, some huge percentage of the history faculty at Harvard were not actually teaching any courses at all that semester. A whole bunch of them were just not idle, doing research, probably writing scholarly papers. There was a paper Professor Vedder at University of Ohio did, making essentially the same point about the University of Texas, that the least busy 20% of the faculty there teaches 2% of the courses. So if that's the way you get ahead as a member of faculty, what can a place like Harvard, a research university, do to kind of, I guess, incentivize undergraduate teaching, teaching freshmen stuff and getting them to work hard and really interacting with students?
Look, I have the scars to show for having worked very hard to bring professors back into the classroom while I was president of Harvard, of having done a fair amount of teaching while I was president of Harvard, of having continued to teach undergraduates as I have returned to be president of Harvard. During my time as president, we went from having freshman seminars for 20% of the students to freshman seminars being universally available for all students. We set off what was an attempt at significant curriculum reform. We substantially increased the emphasis on teaching in evaluation of professors, both in terms of tenure and in terms of compensation. I think we brought about some, I don't want to say an enormous amount, some change in culture. So I'm on your side. On the other hand, let's take some extreme cases, not because the comparison is right, but because they make the point. Suppose you had Niels Bohr on your faculty. Niels Bohr was a brilliant man. He was not a hugely articulate man, but he was a brilliant man. Should Niels Bohr have been spending a lot of his time teaching freshman physics? Was Niels Bohr likely to be very good at meeting with kids who were having trouble understanding the difference between regular momentum and angular momentum? Probably not a great use of Niels Bohr's time. Now, most of the Harvard faculty isn't Niels Bohr, to be sure, but it is worth remembering that John Rawls' book, or just to be politically neutral, Robert Nozick's book, have been changing the lives of tens of thousands of students for decades. Probably at the margin, creating an environment where they could write those books was very important relative to their having done an extra seminar. So I think it is probably appropriate that America have some variety of universities, and that one kind of university that America have be the research university, where you try to bring the best minds together. You ask them to do a certain amount of teaching, but their really highest purpose is to advance human knowledge in a fundamental way. And I think the experience, and one of the things I believed in, I think I can claim probably not more than the members of this group, but more than most of the people in the milieu in which I operated. I believed a lot in metrics, evaluation, data, testing what we were doing, all that kind of stuff. And it turns out that teaching ability at the age of 37 is not all that predictive of teaching ability at the age of 54. And research ability at the age of 37 is actually a good deal more predictive of intellectual distinction at the age of 57. So you could put a lot more emphasis on teaching, but if you put a lot more emphasis on teaching, you wouldn't necessarily get people who are actually going to be great teachers through their whole lifetime. Look, it's not obvious what the bias here is. I have wondered, and this is, the perspective of an economist, I've wondered why there aren't any universities who say, we're going to offer people a different contract. We're going to pay professors 50% more, and we're going to offer them to teach, and we're going to ask them to teach significantly more. And in some sense, if there's really a huge problem that universities are making a huge mistake, they're just letting their faculty not teach. If any one university, if Harvard tried to increase its teaching loads in a major way, what would happen is, and didn't change anything else, what would happen is the faculty go to Yale and Princeton. I mean, it wouldn't be it's not a tenable option for a single university. People who believe in markets and competition should hesitate before concluding that everybody should collude on this. And, you really should, right? You should. So the theory, what the theory would tell you is that if this is really a bad way of producing, that there ought to be a way to start a great university by putting dominant emphasis on teaching and paying in the way that you need to. And I've wondered why that experiment hasn't been done more. I suspect the answer is that over time, teaching ability and research ability and intellectual engagement are more correlated than people think. I suspect that to some degree, it's better to have some kinds of specialization, where some people are actually better as researchers than they are as teachers. I mean, I remember an experience many years ago at Harvard. This was long before I was president, where a very distinguished member of the faculty at Harvard in economics, I won't name him, but trust me, in the upper part of the distribution of Nobel Prize winners, decided one year that, in response to listening to some dean say something like what you're saying, decided that he was going to teach introductory economics. And he made a pretty good effort at teaching introductory economics. And, there was him, there were 2 assistant professors, and there were 23 graduate students who taught sections of introductory economics. So that's 26 sections. Of the 26 sections, his was 16th best, as regarded by the students. Well, probably that was just not a sensible thing to have happen in the world. And so I think one needs to think hard, and I'm, as you can tell from the fact that I'm here and some of the kinds of things I'm saying, that I've got a lot of sympathy with many of the things that ACTA has believed and advocated over time. But I think on this, get all the professors back in the classroom, it's a complicated subject. Now, there's another whole question, which is, okay, there's Niels Bohr. He's probably pretty special. There's the average faculty member at Harvard. They're no Niels Bohr, but maybe they're kind of special too. But at institution number 88 in the United States, maybe they'd actually be spending less time writing their paper for the journal of something that probably not that many people are going to read, and spend more time teaching. And I think that's an argument that I can sort of relate to. I've always been very reluctant to make it because it always seems very snobby coming from somebody at one of the top research universities to say, well, research is fine for us, but you all shouldn't do it. But that is an additional kind of perspective on the issue.
Thank you. I guess as a follow-up, do you think generally that university leaders do a good job kind of figuring out who's really good at research and really freeing them to do research, and figuring out who's awfully good at teaching and let them do that, and at figuring out who's doing an awful lot of one but really ought not to be because they're not so good at it?
I'm sure people could do better. The problem is it's a little more correlated than you'd suppose.
The two.
The two. Let me take a related issue that has actually been pretty substantially studied. Certainly been pretty substantially studied at Harvard and a number of other places. There are a set of very legitimate issues. They press particularly in business schools, but they're around in economics departments. They're around in a variety of places about outside activities of the faculty. And how much outside activity, how much outside commercial activity should the faculty engage in? Here's the problem. It is virtually always the case that if you make a list, which professors are pulling more than their weight as measured by number of students in their classes, number of graduate students advised, number of interactions had with colleagues, benefits provided to the university, and who's pushing the edge of the university's outside activities rules hardest? They're almost always the same people. So then you say to yourself, okay, well, we could crack down, but why should so there's Professor X and there's Professor Y. Professor X, teaches four classes with 162 students and has 9 graduate students, and also is on 3 corporate boards. Professor Y teaches 4 classes with 21 students and has 1 graduate student and is on no corporate boards. You really want to respond to that situation by saying that it's some kind of outrage that Professor X is on 3 corporate boards. Maybe you do, because maybe everybody should do what they're able to and contribute to the university, but it's a complicated, it is a complicated subject. That said, if universities provided more rewards for good teaching, created better incentive systems around teaching, it would be a good thing. Now look, but you got to understand that if you think it's simple in any one of these things, you're probably wrong. I worked very hard at it, teaching awards, special leaves for people who were good teachers, rewards, incentives, set an example myself when I was president. I was on this program. But, it is not, I lost my train. I lost the particular point that I was going to make about the difficulty of generating huge amounts more teaching. If you give people leave because I know what I was going to say. How do you measure who your very valuable teachers are? There's a strong tendency to use the student evaluations. And here's the fact. As long as they don't count for much, student evaluations aren't bad. You just go to a university where nobody much looks at the student evaluations, and you look at the student evaluations, they will turn out to track quite well who's a good professor and who's not. The moment you start to say, you're going to base people's salary, you're going to base people's tenure, you're going to base people's prestige, you're going to base people's reward on the student evaluations, I promise they pander to the students. They start giving high grades, they start schlocking it up, they try to make it more fun for the students, they take the rigor down. So it's a delicate argument. The information is there only as, it's sort of like the Heisenberg principle. The information is there only as long as you don't use it. And so if you want to reward teaching really highly, you have to ask yourself, how are you going to tell who, here I am, I'm President Summers. Let's make it simpler. I'm not President Summers of Harvard, which is vast. I'm President Summers of a college with 600 students in a class. So I actually know to recognize all the professors in my university. I really want to reward the good teachers. How am I going to figure out who they are? How am I going to figure out who they are in a way that is going to have high legitimacy? It's actually easier. You can, same issue arises in 4th grade. In 4th grade, we tend to be more comfortable with standardized tests. But by the way, since we started having high-stakes testing, we've had an epidemic of cheating scandals in urban America. Didn't used to have it. Now that we have high-stakes testing, people cheat. Well, okay, so here we are. How are we going to do it? Well, maybe I can tell who the good physics instructors are and who the not-so-good physics instructors are by assigning a test that's in part a multiple-choice test in physics. Maybe. And maybe that'll tell me something. There are a lot of questions about that in terms of what you really want people to get from a physics education. But suppose the kind of teaching that's involved is the kind of teaching my wife does. You really learn by studying Moby Dick for 8 weeks and Uncle Tom's Cabin for 6 weeks, you really understand how to understand a piece of literature. How are you going to decide in that seminar of 15 people, a bunch of people doing things like that, how are you going to decide, sitting as a university administrator, who's good and who's not. And again, the more you're going to base on the decision, frankly, if you asked me, in the Harvard departments I knew, I could answer that question and I'd be reasonably confident my answers were right. Just because I sort of listened to students, listened to faculty, had a sense of it. But they weren't right enough that I could base substantial rewards on my impressions. And if my impressions were going to count for a lot, I'd no longer be able to form them as accurately. Because people wouldn't, people would say, Joe's really god-awful. They'd stop saying that if that was going to affect Joe's job security. So it's the right thing to do, but it is not an easy thing to do.
It's sort of a distressing thought that I wonder if I gave some of my professors better marks, if they gave me better marks. I mean, you'd hope that as a college student at a place like Harvard or Wesleyan where I went, that you'd be able to sort of separate that evaluation.
The data are unmistakable.
It's a
data are unmistakable.
Shame
on this point. And by the way, it's not just what, look, we've thought of all this, we give the teachers evaluations before the students get their grades rather than after they get their grades. I mean, so people have thought about how to manage this, but it's not just grades, by the way. Do we, we're sitting there, do we assign 30 pages of writing in the semester, or do we assign 15 pages of writing in this semester? We're not so likely to get higher ratings by assigning 30 pages.
Well, this segues nicely into this next question I had. I'm trying to understand all this. There is this website called grade inflation dot something, and Harvard, I guess, is one of the best documented cases. In 1889, the overall grade point average at Harvard was 2.46. Something under a B, right? And in 2005, the overall GPA at Harvard was 3.45, which is a full point higher. And that's just a longer and maybe more dramatic example of something that's been spotted at lots and lots of different colleges, that grades are sort of drifting up, I think, at every sector other than maybe community colleges. And yet there's also ample evidence that the amount of time students spend engaged in scholarship is going down since maybe the Kennedy administration. I think it's been tracked for at least that long. Students, according to NESE, Survey of Student Engagement, I think I might get this wrong, but I think they spend something like 15 hours a week on schoolwork now, where in the 60s they might have spent 35 or something. It's probably not that dramatic, but there's been a big decline in the time students spend actually studying. And people connect this to the idea that there's this longer weekend now in college. The weekend starts on Thursday or something. Part of it is that the people all have laptops, so you can do your work faster. You don't have to write everything out longhand like I suppose that I did. But that can't be all of it, because a lot of this decline has been since the advent of the personal computer. So it's more than that. And then you throw in these evaluations and the idea that the professor gets rewarded by the students for assigning less work and giving out higher grades.
Okay, so look, the input thing is a little complicated. I mean, you got to be a little careful. When I went to college in 1971, it was not uncommon to have studied calculus before you went to college, but it was not the expectation, even if you were planning to study math or physics. Today, anyone who's planning to study math or physics at a top university has surely studied calculus, and they might have studied a little mathematics beyond it. In 1925, it was commonly remarked that relativity theory was only understood by 12 people. Relativity today appears on freshman physics exams. So if you actually ask what students know coming out of college in 2012, it is vastly greater than what they knew coming out in 1867. And while it's harder to make the comparison, they come out knowing more than students did in 1975 when I came out of college. I mean, one of the things that people don't remark on is a kind of general cognitive progress in the society. There's a well-known phenomenon that's not well understood, the Flynn effect. If you measure IQs, the average IQ in the United States and in most countries has risen by between 2 and 3 points a decade for the last 5 decades. You don't believe me? Just do an experiment. Just take you 90 minutes to do this experiment. Just watch one show of the Beverly Hillbillies, which was the most popular show on American television in the 1960s, and watch one show of West Wing, which was the most popular television show in America in the last decade. Just watch them. And you will not be in any doubt that the vast public just has a totally different level of cognitive demand from what it receives. So that I think is a different perspective on the comments you made about the comments you made about people are studying less. But I think the larger point, and the one where I completely agree, is the 4-minute mile was a miracle when Roger Bannister did it, and most good college track teams have somebody who can run a 4-minute mile today, but we still only give 1 gold medal in the Olympics. And so I think grade inflation is deeply problematic. I think a society that tolerates and supports the inflation of the grades of its students should not be surprised when it finds the inflation of reported corporate earnings by those students 20 years later to be a serious problem for itself. And I think there is an enormous amount that universities should think about. It's very much the mood these days that we need to teach people ethics. And I am all for being ethical. But I think of grade inflation as a kind of ethical issue and a kind of example setting issue. I think of the way faculty misconduct is handled as a kind of ethical issue. And I think there's a great deal that universities could do in terms of the way they operate to improve the models of ethical behavior that they set for their students.
A couple of very prominent schools, as I recall, simply set a sort of a formula and said, well, thou shalt not give more than 35% A's or something like that, that we won't have more than 1/3 of all grades be A henceforth. Does that sort of simple solution work?
In some contexts it probably does, and in other contexts it probably doesn't. I was successful in inducing the Harvard faculty to take a situation where 90% of Harvard graduates graduated with honors. When I became president, and to reduce that number to just above 50. 50 is probably a lot, but 50 is at least it was no longer true that the most unique honors you could graduate with was none. which was the case which was the case when I arrived. So in that context, it works. Here's the problem, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So you want to say that only 30% of the grades can be A's, okay? So now, how are we going to allocate the 30% of the grades that are going to be A's? You could say, well, every class can only give 30% of the grades A's. But how about if I take French, where you do, where you get all the way to literacy in 2 semesters, and you take French, where you get all the way to literacy in 4 semesters? Should we have 30% A's in both classes? How about if I take freshman physics with quantum mechanics and relativity, and you take freshman physics for poets? Should we have the same fraction of A's in both classes? So it turns out you have to figure out how you do it.
How you monitor it.
How do you set up a fair, how do you set up a fair system, given that there are courses that differ in their intrinsic difficulties? Now, there are people with sort of economist mathematical skills who have devised algorithms where you basically have to report your grades, and then you get an adjusted grade in each course, and the adjusted grade is based on how able the other students were in the class. So if you have a bunch of superstars, then you adjust the grade downward. So there's mathematical ways of trying to do it, but they tend to be kind of complicated and Byzantine, and therefore they don't seem legitimate and easier to understand. So I would love to see a good way of enforcing mega caps of the kind you describe on grades, but it isn't something that is easy, and there are huge differences in these things. There basically are 2 patterns, and these tend to be quite typical at leading universities if you study it. The first is, just like it's much harder to kill somebody if you have to look at them, it's much harder to give somebody a C if you see them. So nobody in a seminar ever gets a C. Systematic, vast grade inflation in small classes relative to large classes, overwhelming pattern. The second is very substantial grade inflation in the humanities. It differs from across universities in the sciences versus the social sciences, in part because the social sciences tend to have very large classes. But so if you're in a humanities seminar at a leading university and you don't get a high grade, something is badly wrong. I mean, there's a story that used to be told at Harvard. This is actually not about, I don't think this was actually in the humanities, in fairness. I think it was in a different field. During the 60s, when things were really terrible, there was a guy who, the first semester, he gave everybody, all 30 of his students, either 20 of them A's and 10 of them A minuses. The second semester, he gave 19 of them A's and 9 of them A minuses and 2 of them B pluses. And the dean called him in. I think we really need to talk about your grading. The guy interrupted and he said, just a minute, Dean. Those 2 guys, they just didn't understand anything.
I've come back to this 3 or 4 times in my reporting, and I'm fairly new, having spent maybe 2 years doing higher ed, and I'm fascinated by this. ACTA has this sort of rubric in that they will grade a school according to which specific disciplines it requires students to take, like math, science, foreign language. If at Johns Hopkins you have to take math or science, but not math and science, you don't get as much credit for that. If the requirements say that you could take a language or something else, then that's And at a lot of these really great universities, and I don't think ACTA is denying they're great universities, it's real mungy, and you could kind of go through 4 years at a place like Brown or Johns Hopkins or Yale, having not taken a single science course, having not taken a single math course, certainly having not ever read Shakespeare if you don't care to or just don't think of it, or if the squid's eye professor reviews don't give a good grade to the person teaching it, you might just not take it. And there's just a very small number of universities that have core curricula. Chicago, I guess, Columbia, St. John's, the Great Book School, and a number of others. And the guy who runs the program at Chicago told me, and surely you of all people would understand this, that it would be impossible for the University of Chicago to assemble a core curriculum now from nothing. And the reason, I was told, is that each of the disciplines is a little fiefdom, and each of them wants their own stuff included. So suddenly you've got 200 different things that have to be in the core. And that's not a core anymore. It's everything, And so who's going to be the unlucky, soul who has to decide what's in the core curriculum if there is to be a core curriculum? Apparently, it's just an impossible decision that no faculty can arrive at. And so what's the question in all this? And you led Harvard, so. What would do you think there's any scenario in which a place like Harvard, because Harvard used to have a sort of a core curriculum, could it ever have one again?
Harvard had a curriculum that was called a core curriculum when I came, and it now has a curriculum that is a general education curriculum. Neither curriculum prescribed that you learn any particular play of Shakespeare's or aspect of ancient Greece or component of mathematics. I thought the Harvard core, as I found it, was proud of being about ways of knowing. And I thought if we had a little less ways of knowing and a little more knowing, it would be a positive change. And I think to some extent that's been recognized in Harvard's general education curriculum. I've always been kind of torn on this. On the one hand, it is sort of hard to believe that there isn't some body of knowledge that has some commonness to our culture and our moment, to which everyone, while they're in college, should have to have some exposure. That is the great appeal of a core curriculum, and I think it has a lot of logic, really a lot of logic. Just like I've noticed in life that once people get over the age of 25, they tend to be more enthusiastic about conscription than before they're over the age of 25. There is something similar in that. So look, I think I've been at least modestly accomplished and successful intellectually in my life. I have essentially no capacity for foreign languages. I really just really can't understand them when people say it. Just not something I can do. I struggled through high school language for a few years. I went to MIT where they didn't have that requirement. If they had had that requirement, I suppose I probably wouldn't have failed out, but it would have been very painful. And at the end of it, at the end of my required 3 semesters, even if it had been 3 semesters, I would not have been able to speak a foreign language. My wife, who's professor of English at Harvard, would make the same statement about her capacity for mathematics. She had been better off tortured into it? I don't know. I'm guessing there's some people in this room I'm guessing a quarter of you in this room, if you think about it, could think of some area of knowledge where your basic view was you weren't that interested, you weren't that good, you did a certain amount of it in high school, and if you'd been forced to do a year of it in college, it would have been very painful, and the gain would not have been enormous. So I think that's one type of problem you have to think about down the core curriculum route. Second is you do sort of have to decide what's in it. And it's really hard to get a group of faculty members to agree on what's in it. I actually had a much more modest aspiration during my time as president that I made some progress on, but that I was not completely successful in achieving. Forget what's required. Shouldn't we have a 1 semester or a 1 year course where you can study the history of art? Not the history of Matisse in 19th century Paris, but the history of art, or the history of music, or the history of the United States. And I remember one moment which sort of captured a lot of it. I remarked, probably in my usual impolitic way, on the fact that, as best I could tell from a study of the catalog, there was no course at Harvard this year where a student could learn about the American Revolution. George Washington and Madison and the Federalist Papers and the Constitution and all of that. And it just seemed to me that there ought to be a course for a student who wanted to study the American Revolution. And one of the members of the faculty said, "Larry, you're actually not right, though I don't think you'll be much pleased by this correction. There is a course being offered that does talk about the American Revolution. It's a course on the American Revolution, the Guatemalan Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution in comparative perspective." I said, well, whatever the utility of that course, and there may be a lot to learn from that comparison, I don't think that's responsive to the particular itch that I was looking to scratch by asking my question. So I actually think the right aspiration is for there to be more courses that provide the option of being broadly equipped by great teachers for a life of enlightened participation in society. I think there's a fair amount of demand for them on the part of students. I actually think there's less provided than there is demand. And that was kind of where I put my energy, because I think compulsion has a variety of problematic aspects. And the closer you get to it, the more complicated it gets. Okay, so we need to have a language requirement. Well, okay, suppose I grew up in a bilingual household and I'm bilingual. Do I get to say I've satisfied the language requirement, or do I have to take a third language? We have to have a science requirement. Okay, well, suppose I took AP Bio. Does that count? Or, I got a bunch of students who didn't take much science in high school, and they're like taking biology for babies, but I already know everything in biology for babies. Do I still have to do the science requirement, or do I not have to do the science requirement? If you actually pursue it down the road, you find it gets much, much more difficult than you at first think, which is why I never thought that my emphasis was to think that canon should not be a dirty word. That canon, C-A-N-O, canon with one N, should not be a dirty word. But there's a tendency in many parts of academia to think that, I kind of, in areas I don't know much about, I want somebody who's deeply knowledgeable and cares passionately about them to help identify a canon so I can educate myself. So I think of that as a positive process, not as a negative process. But there's something in the culture that tends to react adversely to the word canon.
Larry will have to leave in about 3 minutes. So, Larry, you want to take some questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead and
Had a question. Do you think the tendency of specialized departments in the great universities has a weakness in that leads to a certain kind of scholasticism or perhaps excessive homogeneity of opinion? I'll give you a very brief example. My daughter graduated with a major in economics from Harvard 20 years ago. And when she got out, I got to talking with her a bit about her studies, and we were talking about the great Keynesian revolution of the 1930s and the debate that went on between Keynes and the Austrian school, Hayek and these people. And it turned out that she had never heard of that debate nor of those discussions. Now, that's admittedly, the Austrians are not the mainstream school of economics today and so forth, but she'd never even heard. She said, "Dad, I'm shocked. I missed the great. This was probably the great debate of the century, wasn't it? You know." It occurred to me that perhaps within her studies there had been an excessive homogeneity of opinion, such that they didn't think that it was even worthwhile to raise different points of view on some of the core elements of the basic theoretical apparatus of economics today. Do you have any thoughts about that?
There's a couple parts of that question. The best and the worst of academia happen at the boundaries between disciplines. The best and the worst of academia happen at the boundaries between disciplines. Most of the most important discoveries happen across boundaries. Much of the most interesting discussion and conversation involves the multiplicity of perspective that comes from different disciplines. Much of the worst nonsense is perpetrated by people who describe themselves as being at the boundary of disciplines because they can't really meet the standards of either. And so how you approach the interdisciplinary is a complicated kind of question. There's an element in your question and in the way you asked about it, though you didn't put it this way, about the right versus the left. And I'll bet your daughter learned more about Keynes than she learned about Hayek while she was at Harvard. And look, there's a very legitimate line of argument that seriousness about diversity should include diversity of perspective, and that it's hard. It's a complicated question. If you believe deeply in capitalism, you can work in a company that's for profit, or you can work in a not-for-profit institution. If you hate capitalism, then you really have many fewer choices. And so if you look at people who work in not-for-profit institutions, it can't be very surprising that a disproportionate share of them are people who are less wildly enthusiastic about capitalism. And so I think it's certainly true that, you look at the Harvard faculty, you look at the faculty of any leading university is way to the left of center. On the other hand, that doesn't mean people are discriminating. It's a reflection of who kind of wants to be there. And people are better at teaching what they're enthusiastic about. I would say, in defense of my colleagues in the Harvard Economics Department, that in terms of providing a multiplicity of perspective that includes the right 60% of America, whatever the problems of the economics department, they are as nothing compared to the problems in almost any other social science. And that students they may not be exposed to Hayek because it's a little bit dated, but students, and perhaps they should be, but students almost anywhere will be exposed to Milton Friedman, who would stand for those beliefs. But whoever the equivalent of Milton Friedman is in historiography, in literary study, in sociology, in anthropology, these people are much less likely to find their way into most university curricula. Yeah.
I wanted not to debate the grade point average. I think your point about higher IQ and better preparation is solid. But you know, it seems to me like that's only an argument that grades should be higher if the curriculum has stayed the same and we're still testing them at the same level of vigor as when the preparation was less good and the IQs were lower. It seems to me like wouldn't a better solution be to move towards this 3-year curriculum that's been debated now internationally about maybe the entering calculus class, if we have a lot of people, should be 2 semesters combined. Same thing with sciences. Maybe this is the way to take advantage of this and still, so that a C still equals average performance, but basically now students are graduating more quickly or the courses are more vigorous.
Well, so my point about the 4-minute mile was intended to say that I did not embrace the defense of grade inflation that the students are smarter now. I was only trying to say that if you were going to say the students worked less, it seems fair to also point out that they know more. But I, on balance, agree with the perspective, which is there can only be so many excellent people and that excellence has to be judged in relative terms. I think you were really using the grade inflation as a hook to ask me what I thought about the 3-year curriculum. Well, I don't know what I'm kind of uncertain about what I think. It's true that it's an international standard. It's also true that students at American universities have, in a large number of cases, extracurricular lives that they find very stimulating. Whether it's, and I don't mean social life, I mean whether it's athletics, whether it's student journalism, whether it's student artistic performance, whether it's employment, that there are a large number of students who find that would be much more difficult to accommodate in a 3-year standard curriculum. And I think there's a lot that's positive in that. I think if you have a 3-year curriculum, people are thinking about leaving more or less as soon as they're after they've just arrived, and I don't find our universities under-vocationalized at the moment. And I think the 3-year curriculum would push in that direction. So whereas, as I looked at things in education, I thought, I might be wrong, and there are people who find this view offensive, my instinct was almost nothing would be lost if law was a 2-year degree. So I relate to the concept of shortening, looking at what happens in the 2nd and 3rd years of law school. And whereas I thought that something probably should be done about the 9-year PhD, which is all too common, particularly in some of the humanistic disciplines, or the perpetual postdoc that's becoming more common in the sciences. So I'm not averse on principle to compression arguments. I don't find myself seized with the 3-year curriculum as being an especially high as being an especially high priority. I think a different question is, you need one level of persuasion to convince somebody that something should be the norm, and you need another level of persuasion to convince somebody that something should be an option.